Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Century-Old Dupes. The year was 1926, and Seoul, then Gyeongsang, smelled of coal smoke, damp earth, and the metallic tang of impending transition. Kang Gunwoo didn't feel like a pioneer of a new era. He felt like a man who had taken a very wrong turn into a very dark alley. The knife wound in his abdomen was a blooming heat, a pulsing rhythm that hummed in sync with his fading heartbeat. He slumped against a brick wall, his fingers clutching his waistcoat, watching the crimson stain spread like an inkblot test. Well, Gunwoo wheezed, a bubble of blood popping on his lip. That's inconvenient. The shadows at the end of the alley didn't just move, they curdled. They gathered into a tall, terrifying pillar of void that swallowed the moonlight. From the darkness emerged a figure draped in robes so black they seemed to pull at the air around them. A heavy, silver-edged scythe scraped against the cobblestones, scritch, 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 a sound that vibrated in Gunwoo's very marrow. Song Jiho, Reaper of the Seventh Circle, stepped into the light. Or rather, the light died where he stood. He was the end of all things. He was the cold silence of the grave. He reached into the folds of his sleeve and pulled out a scroll that unrolled with a heavy, parchment snap. Kang Gunwoo, the Reaper spoke. His voice was a tectonic shift, a bass frequency that rattled Gunwoo's teeth. Born of the year of the ox. Your debt is called. Your thread is severed. Gunwoo looked up, his vision blurring. About time. It hurts like a bitch. Jiho tucked the scroll away and raised the scythe. The blade gleamed with a hungry, blue luminescence. This was the moment. The harvest. Jiho leaned in to hook the soul from the meat, but then, he paused. He looked at Gunwoo. Truly looked at him. Gunwoo had a smudge of soot on his cheek and a defiant, slightly annoyed sparkle in his dying eyes. He looked like a man who was late for dinner and blamed the Reaper for the delay. Jiho's grip on the scythe faltered. He's remarkably symmetrical, the Reaper thought, a stray, highly unprofessional observation flickering through his mind. And his soul, it smells like cedarwood and stubbornness. Hurry up, Gunwoo grunted, his head lolling back. I'm losing the light. Jiho cleared his throat, a sound like grinding stones. He lowered the scythe an inch. Then two. He looked at the scroll again. Then at the dying man. He looked at the scythe. Jiho started. His voice cracked. The Great Reaper of the Seventh Circle actually squeaked. What? Gunwoo panted. I think I have the wrong address, Jiho lied. It was the most blatant, cosmic-level lie ever told in the history of the universe. The wrong? My name is on the paper. Gunwoo coughed, spitting blood onto Jiho's pristine black hem. I'm literally right here. Bleeding. Take it. No, Jiho said, his voice rising in a panicked pitch. He started backing away into the shadows, his robes getting caught on a stray crate. The bureaucracy is very complex this century. Paperwork error. Stay put. Don't move. Don't die. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Wait. You skeletal coward. Come back. But the shadows had already snapped shut. The alley was empty, save for a very confused, very wounded Gunwoo. He waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. His wound stopped pulsing. To his absolute horror, the blood started to clot. The pain receded into a dull itch. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the hole in his stomach had closed into a neat, silver scar. Gunwoo stood up, dusted off his trousers, and looked at the spot where the personification of death had just stood. You have got to be kidding me, he muttered. He didn't know it yet, but his name would remain on that unchecked list for the next 100 years. Song Jiho had just pulled the ultimate, no call, no show, and Kang Gunwoo was now the universe's most frustrated immortal. Chapter 2, The Reaper Next Door. Seoul, 2026. Kang Gunwoo hated moving. He hated the cardboard boxes, the tape that never tore straight, and the general sense of upheaval. But mostly, he hated that he was still alive to do it. After a century of accidents that should have ended him, including a particularly dramatic tumble off a bridge in the 70s and a lightning strike during a hike, he had developed a cynical sort of resilience. He was currently dragging a box of heavy history books into Unit 302 of a sleek, modern apartment complex. He was sweating, his shirt sticking to his back, and his mood was somewhere between mildly homicidal and exhausted. Then, he heard it. Scritch. 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 It wasn't a scythe on cobblestones this time. It was the sound of a high-end designer loafer dragging slightly against the polished hallway tile. Gunwoo froze. That rhythm. That specific, heavy silence that followed it. He dropped his box with a loud thud and spun around. Standing by the door of Unit 301 was a man who looked like he had stepped off the cover of a high-fashion funeral magazine. He was tall, infuriatingly so, with skin the color of expensive parchment and silver hair that glimmered. He was wearing a charcoal turtleneck that cost more than Gunwoo's entire furniture set and was currently struggling to fit a keycard into his smart lock. Gunwoo's eyes narrowed. The face was more defined, the robes were gone, and the skeletal aura had been replaced by the scent of cold ozone and expensive cologne, but Gunwoo would know that terrified, awkward posture anywhere. "You," Gunwoo said, his voice flat. The man in the turtleneck stiffened. He didn't turn around. Instead, he stared intensely at his door lock, his hand trembling slightly. I think you have the wrong person. I am a normal human. I enjoy taxes and carbohydrates." "Turn around, Song Jiho," Gunwoo commanded, stepping into the hallway. The Reaper sighed, a sound like a winter wind through dead leaves, and slowly turned. Up close, he was devastatingly handsome in a way that felt predatory and polite all at once. His eyes were dark pools of ancient starlight, currently wide with the panic of a cat caught in a bathtub. "Gunwoo," Jiho greeted, his voice dropping into that familiar, tectonic bass. "You look, well. For a man who is 123 years old. I look like a man who hasn't had a good night's sleep since the Japanese occupation." Gunwoo snapped, closing the distance between them. He poked a finger into Jiho's very solid, very expensive-feeling chest. "What are you doing here? Is this it? Is the paperwork finally finished? Am I finally checking out?" Jiho looked down at the finger on his chest, then back at Gunwoo's face. He looked genuinely distressed. "Actually, I'm your neighbor. I'm on a sabbatical. A forced leave of absence." Gunwoo blinked. "A sabbatical? From death?" "The ministry was not pleased that your file has remained open for 10 decades, Jiho whispered, leaning in closer. The air around him was noticeably 10 degrees colder. "They've stripped me of my scythe and my title until I resolve the anomaly. I had to lease this unit. It turns out the underworld has very poor credit scores." Gunwoo let out a dry, hysterical laugh. "So, let me get this straight. You failed to kill me for a century, and now you're living next to me to resolve it? Great. Do it now. Take me out. Use a kitchen knife, use the elevator, I don't care." Jiho's expression shifted from panic to a strange, brooding pout. He grabbed Gunwoo's wrist, his grip icy and firm. "I told you in the alley, Gunwoo. I can't. Not yet. The conditions aren't optimal. It's been 100 years. When is it optimal?" "Your trash is leaking," Jiho said suddenly, pointing at the box Gunwoo had dropped. "In this realm, I think they call it a hygiene violation." "Welcome to the building, neighbor." With a swift beep of his door lock, the Reaper ducked inside Unit 301, leaving a stunned, fuming Gunwoo alone in the hallway. "You coward!" Gunwoo yelled at the closed door. "I'm leaving my door unlocked. Come in and finish the job, you oversized goth." From behind the door, he heard a muffled, dignified response. "Lock your door, Gunwoo. The crime rate in this district is statistically significant." Chapter 3, The Suicide Watch Wingman. By the end of the first week, Kang Gunwoo had realized that Song Jiho wasn't just a Reaper, he was a cosmic-grade micromanager. Gunwoo sat at his kitchen island, staring down a container of seafood surprise that had been sitting in the back of his fridge since before he'd moved in. It was a fuzzy, neon-green ecosystem of its own. He raised a plastic fork, his eyes fixed on the wall separating his unit from 301. 2. The wall didn't just rattle, it frosted. A thin layer of crystalline ice bloomed over the wallpaper as the air turned sharp enough to sting. Suddenly, Jiho was just there, leaning against the refrigerator with his arms crossed, looking deeply offended. "That contains 3 strains of bacteria currently unknown to modern science, Gunwoo," Jiho said, his voice a low rumble of tectonic disapproval. "If you eat that, your soul will attempt to flee through your throat simply to escape the smell. I will not have it." "Then take it." Gunwoo snapped, waving the fork. "Take the soul. It's right here, ready for the taking. I'm literally offering you a buffet." Jiho reached out, his hand moving with supernatural speed. He snatched the container and tossed it into the trash with a look of pure disgust. "I am a Reaper of the 7th Circle, not a specialist in food poisoning. Have some dignity." The attempts only escalated from there. Gunwoo tried extreme parkour off the roof of a nearby convenience store, only to find the pavement suddenly felt like a Tempur-Pedic mattress the moment he landed. He tried to walk into traffic, but every car that came within a meter of him suffered a sudden, simultaneous engine stall. The breaking point happened on a rainy Tuesday. Gunwoo, frustrated by a century of blue-balled mortality, stepped off the curb directly into the path of a speeding city bus. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact. Finally, he thought. The big sleep. Instead of a bone-crushing impact, there was a sound like a thunderclap without the lightning. The world jerked. Gunwoo felt a strange, elastic sensation, his vision blurring into a sepia-toned haze as his spirit began to drift upward, finally untethered from his stubborn ribcage. Yes, he thought, drifting. It's so quiet. Absolutely not. The voice boomed through the ethereal plane. A cold, pale hand reached into the air and grabbed Gunwoo's soul by the metaphorical collar. With a violent, unceremonious shove, Jiho literally rammed the spirit back into Gunwoo's body. It felt like being stuffed into a suitcase 2 sizes too small. Gunwoo gasped, his lungs burning as he slammed back into the physical world. He wasn't on the road. He was in a narrow, damp alleyway 2 blocks away, pinned firmly against a brick wall. Jiho was vibrating with a terrifying, frigid rage. His human facade was slipping, his eyes were entirely black, and the air around them was swirling with shadowy embers. He had Gunwoo pinned by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the denim of Gunwoo's jacket. "Are you insane?" Jiho roared, his breath smelling like winter and ancient incense. "I am trying to save my existence, and you are playing tag with a public transit vehicle. I want to go." Gunwoo yelled back, his own adrenaline peaking. He grabbed Jiho's lapels, shaking him. "You've kept me in this waiting room for 100 years. Just let me die, you selfish, beautiful idiot." Jiho's breath hitched at the word beautiful. The rage in his eyes shifted, darkening into something far more dangerous than professional frustration. He leaned in, his face inches from Gunwoo's. "You think this is easy for me?" Jiho hissed. "Watching you walk into shadows every single day, knowing that the moment I do my job, you're gone. You are the only thing I've looked at for a century, Gunwoo. You are my only anchor to a world that makes no sense. Before Gunwoo could retort, Jiho tilted his head and lunged. He didn't go for the soul, he went for the skin. His teeth sank into the junction where Gunwoo's neck met his shoulder, a sharp, stinging nip that felt like a brand of ownership. Gunwoo let out a choked sound, half gasp, half moan. The coldness of Jiho's lips was a shocking contrast to the heat blooming in Gunwoo's chest. When Jiho pulled back, his eyes were blown wide, searching Gunwoo's face for a second before crashing their mouths together. The kiss was desperate, angry, and tasted of 100 years of suppressed longing. Jiho's tongue was clever and hungry, claiming Gunwoo's mouth with the same possessive authority he used to claim souls. Gunwoo's hands traveled up to Jiho's hair, pulling him closer, demanding more of the icy contact that made his blood feel like it was finally, truly, boiling. In that damp alley, the line between death and executioner vanished. It wasn't a final appointment. It was a declaration of war. Chapter 4: The Cold Reality. The aftermath of the alleyway was a suffocating, charged silence that followed them back to the 4th floor. Gunwoo's neck still throbbed where Jiho's teeth had grazed him, a phantom heat that felt like a permanent brand. He touched the skin, staring at his reflection in the elevator's brushed metal doors. "You missed," Gunwoo muttered, his voice raspy. Jiho stood in the corner of the elevator, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His charcoal turtleneck was slightly rumpled, and his eyes remained fixed on the floor numbers as they ticked upward. "I did not miss. I redirected. You kissed me, Jiho. That's a pretty big detour from reaping my soul." The elevator chimed. As Jiho stepped out, the lights in the hallway flickered violently. For a split second, the Reaper's entire left arm didn't just go pale, it turned into a hazy, static-filled transparency. Gunwoo could see the pattern of the wallpaper right through Jiho's bicep. Gunwoo's heart did a jagged skip. He lunged forward, grabbing Jiho's sleeve. "Jiho! Your arm, it's gone." Jiho snatched his arm back, his expression hardening into a mask of cold indifference. "It is a temporary fluctuation. The atmospheric pressure in this building is substandard. Don't give me that atmospheric crap." Gunwoo followed him into Unit 301, ignoring the fact that he hadn't been invited. The apartment was a minimalist's nightmare, or a Reaper's dream. It was bone-white, freezing cold, and lacked any personal touches except for a single, ancient-looking hourglass on the mantel. "Sit down," Gunwoo commanded. Jiho sat. He looked smaller than usual, his broad shoulders hunched. As he reached for a glass of water, his fingers glitched again, a digital-like stutter of reality where his hand vanished and reappeared 3 times in a second. "Talk," Gunwoo said, kneeling on the rug in front of him. "Now. Why are you turning into a bad Wi-Fi signal?" Jiho stared at his flickering hand, his gaze weary. "The balance, Gunwoo. The universe is a ledger, and I am the clerk. For 100 years, I have carried an outstanding debt, you. Every day your name remains on my list without a check mark, the system compensates." "Compensates how?" "By reclaiming the energy from the source," Jiho whispered. His voice lacked its usual tectonic weight, it sounded brittle, like dry parchment. "Because I refuse to take your life force, the underworld is taking mine. I am being erased, Gunwoo. Unmade. Soon, there will be no song Jiho to collect anything." The reality of it hit Gunwoo like a physical blow. He'd spent a century thinking he was the victim of a cosmic prank, but the prankster was the one paying the price. "Then do it," Gunwoo said, his voice cracking. He grabbed Jiho's translucent hand, surprised to find that while he couldn't see it clearly, it still felt like solid, freezing marble. "Take the soul. Right now. I'm giving it to you. I don't want to live in a world where you've been unmade just to keep me breathing." Jiho looked at him, and for the first time in a century, the Reaper looked truly terrified. "If I take your soul," Jiho said, a single, cold tear tracking down his pale cheek, "you go to the great beyond. You will be reborn, or you will rest, or you will become part of the stars. But Reapers, we are shadows. We stay in the dark. If I finish the job, I will never see your face again. I will never hear you complain about your neighbors or your cold coffee." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Gunwoo's. The air between them hummed with the sound of a failing engine. "I would rather fade into nothingness holding your hand," Jiho breathed, "than exist for eternity knowing I was the one who sent you where I can never follow." Gunwoo's grip tightened. He looked at the man who had stalked him through history, his shadow, his tormentor, his only constant. "You're an idiot, Song Jiho. A sentimental, cosmic idiot." "Perhaps," Jiho whispered as his chest flickered, showing the white sofa behind him for a fleeting, terrifying moment. "But I have always been very bad at my job." Chapter 5, The Breaking Point. The tension between them had become a physical weight, a pressurized chamber waiting for a single spark. It finally detonated 3 days later, not in the quiet of their apartments, but amidst the screeching metal and billowing smoke of a literal disaster. A gas main in a nearby commercial block had ignited, turning a 3-story office building into a skeletal cage of fire. Gunwoo, driven by a century-old instinct to finally force the end, had dashed into the black smoke to pull a trapped courier toward the exit. He'd succeeded, shoving the coughing man into the arms of a firefighter, but as he turned to leave, a structural beam groaned, a sound like a dying giant, and collapsed. The world went white. Then black. Then, a sudden, violent vacuum. Gunwoo felt his soul lurch, the suitcase of his ribs finally popping open. He was hovering, looking down at his own soot-covered body pinned under a mountain of drywall and timber. He felt light. He felt free. "No. Not like this. I said not like this." The roar didn't come from the fire. It came from the shadows. Jiho materialized in the center of the inferno, his human suit forgotten. He looked like a storm given form, his eyes swirling with obsidian rage. He didn't use a scythe, he used his bare hands, tearing through scorched wood and twisted rebar as if they were wet paper. He reached into the ether, grabbed Gunwoo's drifting spirit, and slammed it back into the unconscious body with enough force to shatter the remaining windows in the block. Gunwoo woke up screaming, his lungs seizing as they sucked in ash and oxygen. He was suddenly being hauled upward, tucked under a powerful arm, and carried through a wall of flame that parted like the Red Sea before Jiho's sheer, freezing presence. They didn't stop until they were back in Gunwoo's apartment, the door slammed and locked with a telekinetic thud. "You absolute moron!" Jiho screamed. He wasn't the composed, poetic Reaper anymore. He was shaking, his hair wild, his expensive turtleneck shredded and blackened by soot. "You tried to leave. You tried to slip away in a pile of garbage and smoke. I was saving someone." Gunwoo roared back, stumbling toward him, coughing up gray phlegm. "And it would have been over. You could have stayed. You wouldn't be flickering like a cheap light bulb if you just let the beam finish the job. I don't want to stay in a world where you are a memory." Jiho lunged forward, grabbing Gunwoo's collar so hard the fabric groaned. "I have watched empires fall, Gunwoo. I have seen stars go dark. None of it mattered until I saw you bleeding in that alley in 1926. You are the only thing that is real. Then make me real." Gunwoo yelled, his face inches from Jiho's. "Stop being a ghost. Stop being a spectator. If you won't kill me, then for once in 100 years, live with me." The silence that followed was deafening. Jiho's grip tightened, his knuckles white. His eyes searched Gunwoo's, searching for the fear that should be there when facing death, but finding only a reflection of his own desperate hunger. Jiho crashed his mouth against Gunwoo's. This wasn't the angry nip of the alleyway. This was a total surrender. They stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp, then a chair, until they hit the bedroom door. Gunwoo's hands were everywhere, tearing at the ruined turtleneck, feeling the terrifying, marble-smooth skin beneath. When they hit the bed, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept across the headboard in jagged, beautiful patterns. Gunwoo gasped as Jiho's weight settled over him. The Reaper was heavy, solid, and unnaturally cold, like laying beneath a glacier. "You're freezing," Gunwoo whispered, his breath hitching as Jiho's icy fingers traced the line of his hip. "I know," Jiho rasped, his voice a low, melodic vibration against Gunwoo's throat. Do you want me to stop?" Gunwoo responded by wrapping his legs around Jiho's waist, pulling him flush against his own feverish heat. "Don't you dare. For the first time in a century, I actually feel like I'm burning. Don't let the fire go out." In the dim light of the frost-covered room, they finally gave in. It was a chaotic, intense union of heat and ice, of the mortal and the eternal. Every touch from Jiho felt like a brand, a claim that went deeper than skin, marking Gunwoo's very essence. For that hour, the checklist was forgotten. There were no reapers, no undying men, and no debts. There was only the rhythmic, synchronized thrum of two souls finally deciding to occupy the same space, regardless of the cost. Chapter 6: The Ghost in the Machine. The peace of the morning after was brittle. The frost on the headboard hadn't melted, it had crystallized into intricate, jagged patterns that sparkled in the pale Seoul sunlight. Gunwoo woke to the sensation of a cold weight across his chest, Jiho's arm, solid and marble-smooth, pinning him to the mattress. But as Gunwoo reached out to touch Jiho's hand, his fingers passed right through the Reaper's wrist. "Jiho!" Jiho bolted upright, his eyes snapping open. He looked at his hand, which was currently a translucent gray blur against the white sheets. He flexed his fingers, and the reality of them stuttered, vanishing and reappearing with a sickening, high-pitched hum. "It is accelerating," Jiho whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from the end of a long, metallic tunnel. "The system has detected the breach. Last night, we crossed a line the ledger cannot ignore." Before Gunwoo could respond, the temperature in the room didn't just drop, it died. The air turned gray, the color draining from the walls, the bedsheets, and Gunwoo's own skin. Outside the window, the bustling sounds of the city cut out as if a giant hand had pressed mute. 3 figures materialized at the foot of the bed. They wore the same void-black robes Jiho had discarded a century ago, but they lacked his hesitation. They didn't have faces, only hoods filled with a swirling, hungry darkness. "Song Jiho," the middle figure spoke. The voice wasn't a sound, it was a vibration in the floorboards. "The auditor has arrived. The debt of 1926 is overdue." Jiho stood, and for a moment, the flickering stopped. He drew himself up to his full, terrifying height, his aura expanding until the bedroom windows cracked under the pressure. "He is mine. The soul has been marked." "A mark is not a harvest," the auditor countered. 2 of the figures drifted forward, their silver scythes manifesting in their hands with a shrill, metallic ring. "The anomaly must be purged. The mortal goes to the beyond. The traitor goes to the void. Over my dead body." Gunwoo shouted, scrambling out of bed and grabbing the heaviest thing nearby, a thick history book. It was a pathetic defense against the personification of entropy, but he stood in front of Jiho anyway. The auditors didn't laugh, they didn't have the capacity. One of them raised a scythe, the blade glowing with a sickly, necrotic green light. "The mortal is irrelevant. Move, or be shredded." Jiho didn't move. He stepped in front of Gunwoo, his hands glowing with a frantic, desperate blue energy. "I spent a century failing to kill him. Do you really think I'll let a bunch of glorified accountants do it for me?" The fight was a blur of shadows and light. Jiho fought like a man possessed, his movements a lethal dance of ice and willpower. He parried scythe blows with his bare hands, the sparks of soul energy flying like fireworks. But every time he used his power, he flickered. Every strike he landed cost him a piece of his own existence. Jiho, stop! Gunwoo cried out as Jiho's torso turned completely transparent for a 3-second stretch, allowing a scythe to pass harmlessly, but painfully, through his essence. You're disappearing. I am, fine. Jiho gasped, slamming his palm into the lead auditor's chest, sending the creature flying through the bedroom wall into the living room. The battle spilled into the hallway of the apartment complex. The auditors were relentless. They weren't fighting for passion, they were fighting for a balance sheet. To them, Gunwoo was just a line of code that refused to delete. Jiho managed to force them back, creating a barrier of solid frost across the hallway that hissed with divine power. He turned to Gunwoo, his face as pale as death itself, his eyes shimmering with a terrifying finality. They won't stop, Jiho rasped, leaning against the doorframe as his legs began to fade into a smoky mist. They will send more. They will send the high executioners. And I am running out of me, Gunwoo. Gunwoo looked at the frosted barrier, then at the man who was literally erasing himself to keep a dead man walking. The cat and mouse game wasn't funny anymore. The comedy had bled out, leaving only a cold, hard truth. We need to leave, Gunwoo said, his voice steady for the first time in years. Not to a safe house. Not to another city. We need a final appointment, Jiho. On our terms. Chapter 7, The Final Appointment. The auditors were held at bay, but only just. The frost barrier across the hallway hissed and crackled, a fragile dam against an ocean of cold, bureaucratic inevitability. Inside Unit 302, the air was unnaturally still. We're leaving, Gunwoo said, pulling a worn leather jacket over his shoulders. Jiho leaned against the wall, his form flickering like a film reel about to snap. There is nowhere to go, Gunwoo. They track the soul, not the body. To them, you are a beacon in a dark room. I don't care about them, Gunwoo snapped, grabbing Jiho's hand. It felt like holding a handful of dry ice, stinging, numbing, and vanishing. I've spent 100 years waiting to die. I'm not spending my last day hiding in a hallway. You're taking me out. A real date. No scythes, no suicide attempts. Just us. Jiho looked at their joined hands, one warm and tan, the other a pale, translucent shimmer. A slow, heartbreaking smile touched the Reaper's lips. You are remarkably bossy for a mortal, Kang Gunwoo. And you're remarkably slow for a supernatural assassin. Move. They slipped out the fire escape, bypassing the auditors who were still methodically dismantling Jiho's frost wall. For the next 12 hours, the world belonged to them. They started at a small, ancient gukbap restaurant in a corner of the city that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Gunwoo ate with a ferocity he hadn't felt in decades, while Jiho sat across from him, nursing a cup of tea he couldn't actually taste. You know, Gunwoo said, wiping his mouth. In 1945, I thought for sure you'd show up during the liberation. Lots of chaos. Easy cover. Jiho leaned back, his eyes tracking a stray snowflake outside the window. I was there. I was standing on the roof of the pharmacy across from your house. I had the scroll open. But you were laughing with your neighbors, sharing a bottle of smuggled rice wine. You looked triumphant. I couldn't bring myself to interrupt the party. Softy, Gunwoo teased, but his voice lacked its usual bite. They wandered through Namsan Park as the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. They took a photo in one of those cramped, neon-lit booths, 4 vertical frames of them. In the first, they stood stiffly. In the second, Gunwoo made a peace sign. In the third, Jiho looked at Gunwoo with such raw, terrifying adoration that it made Gunwoo's breath hitch. In the fourth, they were kissing, the Reaper's form so blurred by the camera's sensor that he looked like a trick of the light. As night fell, they ended up at the Han River. The water was a dark, churning ribbon reflecting the neon skyscrapers of a Seoul that had grown up around Gunwoo while he wasn't looking. "I used to hate this city," Gunwoo whispered, leaning against the railing. "It kept changing, and I stayed the same. It felt like a race I was losing." Jiho stood beside him. He was barely there now. The wind seemed to blow right through his chest, and his voice was a mere vibration in the air. "I hated it too. Because every time it changed, I feared I would lose you in the crowd. I stayed a Reaper because it was the only way I was allowed to watch you." Gunwoo turned, taking Jiho's face in his hands. The skin felt like fine silk over cold stone. "No more watching, Jiho. No more chasing. Gunwoo. The sun is going to come up soon," Gunwoo said, his voice steady. "And when it does, I want to be at peace. I'm tired, Jiho. Not ready to give up, tired. Just finished. I've lived 5 lifetimes worth of years. I've loved a ghost for a century. I think that's a pretty good run." Jiho closed his eyes, leaning into Gunwoo's palms. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified of the fall but unable to turn back. "I'm afraid," the Reaper confessed, a sound so small it was almost lost to the river's current. "I'm afraid that if I do this, I will lose the only thing that made me feel alive." "You won't lose me," Gunwoo promised, though they both knew it was a lie the universe wouldn't back up. "You'll just finally finish your paperwork." Chapter 8, The Beautiful Disintegration. The sky over the Han River was shifting from a bruised purple to a pale, watery gold. The city was waking up, the distant hum of traffic beginning to pulse like a slow heartbeat, but for Gunwoo and Jiho, the world had shrunk to the few square feet of pavement beneath their feet. Jiho was barely a silhouette. The sunrise was bleeding through his chest, turning his physical form into a shimmering, heat-haze mirage. He looked down at his hands, the fingers were gone, replaced by drifting embers of blue-black smoke. "Gunwoo," Jiho rasped. The sound didn't come from his throat, it resonated directly in Gunwoo's mind, a mournful, cello-like vibration. "The auditors, they are at the edge of the bridge. They are waiting for me to fail again so they can tear you apart." Gunwoo looked back. 3 tall, gray shadows stood perfectly still 100 yards away, their robes snapping in a wind that no one else could feel. They were patient. They knew the clock had run out. "They're not going to get the chance," Gunwoo said. He stepped closer, stepping into the freezing cloud of Jiho's fading essence. He felt the cold seep into his bones, but he didn't flinch. "I'm tired of the chase, Jiho. 100 years of being a glitch. I want to rest. And I want you to be safe." "I cannot," Jiho whispered, the smoke of his form swirling in agitation. "If I take you, the light in this world goes out for me." "Then find me in the next one," Gunwoo countered, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp grief. He grabbed the front of Jiho's flickering sweater, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. "Look at me. I'm right here. I'm giving you my debt. Pay it, Jiho. For us." Jiho let out a broken, jagged sound, a sob that had been building for a century. Slowly, trembling, he raised his right hand. It wasn't a scythe that manifested, but a soft, glowing light that pooled in his palm. It was the color of a winter moon. "I love you," Jiho breathed. It was the first time he had said it aloud in 100 years. The confession seemed to stabilize his form for one final, agonizing second. "I know," Gunwoo smiled, tears finally spilling over. "Now, do your job, Reaper." Jiho closed his eyes and pressed his palm against Gunwoo's chest, right over the spot where the mugger's knife had struck in 1926. There was no pain. Instead, Gunwoo felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of warmth, as if he had finally stepped out of a blizzard and into a heated room. He felt the suitcase of his ribs fly open, but this time, there was no one to shove the soul back in. Gunwoo didn't leave a body behind. Because he had been an anomaly for so long, held together only by Jiho's stubbornness and cosmic luck, his physical form couldn't sustain itself without the soul. He began to turn into fine, golden dust, beginning at his fingertips and moving upward. Jiho watched, his heart breaking in a way that reapers weren't supposed to be capable of. He reached out to catch the dust, but it slipped through his translucent fingers like sand through an hourglass. "Wait," Jiho choked out. "Just one more second." But the wind caught the gold. Within moments, the space where Kang Gunwoo had stood was empty. The only thing left was a small, silver pendant lying on the concrete, still warm from a heartbeat that had finally stopped. Jiho fell to his knees, his own form flickering violently as the underworld reclaimed its power. He clutched the pendant to his chest, let out a silent, soul-shattering scream, and vanished just as the auditors reached him. The sun rose fully over the river. To the morning commuters, it was just another Wednesday. To the universe, a century-old debt had finally been settled. Chapter 9, The Void. The underworld did not have a courtroom. It had the ether, a vast, marble-cold expanse where the ceiling was a swirling nebula of unfiled souls and the floor was a mirror that reflected only one's greatest failures. Jiho stood in the center of it. He was no longer the handsome neighbor in a charcoal turtleneck. He was stripped back to his essence, a tall, flickering shadow in tattered robes, his silver scythe lying snapped and dull at his feet. The auditors stood in a silent circle around him, their cowls tilted as if listening to the heartbeat of the universe itself. "Song Jiho," a voice resonated. It wasn't one person speaking, it was the collective weight of every soul ever harvested. "You have settled the debt of 1926. But in doing so, you have committed the ultimate heresy. You loved the harvest. You bartered with time." Jiho didn't look up. He was staring at his hands. They were solid again, but they felt heavy, leaden with the memory of golden dust slipping through them. "I didn't barter," he whispered, his voice like dry autumn leaves. "I surrendered. The system requires a recalibration," the voice continued, cold and indifferent as a glacier. "For 100 years of dereliction, you shall serve 100 years of isolation. You are sentenced to the void." The floor beneath Jiho didn't open, it simply ceased to exist. He fell. There was no wind, no sound, and no light. The void was the space between heartbeats, the nothingness that existed before the universe decided to be something. It was designed to strip a spirit of its identity. Without external stimuli, a reaper's mind usually unraveled within a decade, turning them into mindless drones of the dark, who could harvest souls without feeling a thing. Jiho landed in the silence. It was a physical pressure against his ears. "I am Song Jiho," he thought, his mental voice echoing in the emptiness. "I lived in Unit 301. I hated the smell of Gunwoo's seafood takeout." He sat cross-legged in the dark. He reached into the phantom pocket of his soul and pulled out the only thing that had survived the transition, the silver pendant. It shouldn't have been there, objects of the living world weren't allowed in the void, but perhaps the universe was tired of arguing with him. "Year 1, Jiho whispered. The sound died the moment it left his lips. He closed his eyes and began to reconstruct Gunwoo's face. He started with the eyes, that specific, defiant sparkle from the 1926 alleyway. Then the nose, slightly crooked from a fall in the 40s. Then the mouth, which had tasted like rain and desperation on the Han River. Year 10. The silence began to scream. Jiho's memory of the neighborly argument started to fade. He couldn't remember the color of Gunwoo's apartment walls. Were they white? Or eggshell? He panicked, clutching the pendant until it bit into his palm. Year 50. Jiho was losing his own name. He was becoming the shadow the underworld wanted him to be. But every time the darkness tried to swallow him, he touched the pendant. He remembered the coldness of his own skin against Gunwoo's heat. He remembered the feeling of being beautiful for 1 second. Year 99. Jiho was a statue of grief. He hadn't moved in decades. His eyes were milky and blind, staring into a darkness that had become his only companion. But deep inside the core of his spirit, a single spark remained. A single name, etched so deeply into his essence that not even the void could scrub it away. Kang Gunwoo. Time is up, the darkness whispered. A door of light cracked open in the ceiling of the nothingness. Jiho didn't move at first. He had forgotten how to walk. He had forgotten how to breathe. But as the light touched his face, he felt a phantom warmth, the ghost of a golden disintegration. He stood up, his joints creaking like ancient gates. He tucked the pendant into his chest and stepped into the light. He was no longer a reaper of the seventh circle. He was just a soul, ancient and weary, looking for a home. Epilogue, the 21-26 reunion. The world Jiho stepped back into was loud, bright, and smelled of ozone and synthetic rain. Seoul had rebuilt itself toward the clouds, glass spires now pierced the atmosphere, and the Han River was spanned by bridges of shimmering light. Jiho felt like a relic. He dressed in clothes that felt like ghosts, a simple black coat and boots, and wandered the streets. He was no longer a reaper. The underworld had stripped him of his scythe and his status, leaving him a wandering spirit in a semi-permanent human shell. He was just a man with too many memories and a silver pendant heavy in his pocket. He walked toward the park near the river, the same spot where they had watched the sun rise a century ago. The trees were taller now, their bioluminescent leaves casting a soft, teal glow over the paths. "Is this it?" Jiho whispered to the wind. 100 years of silence just to walk through a city that doesn't know me? He sat on a bench, his hands trembling. The void had left him fragile. Every noise felt like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back, and let the silver pendant rest against his palm. "Excuse me?" The voice hit him like a lightning strike. Jiho's eyes snapped open. It wasn't the tectonic rumble of a reaper or the echoing silence of the void. It was a voice full of life, bright, impatient, and deeply familiar. Standing a few feet away was a young man. He was wearing a high-collared tech jacket and carrying a bag of groceries that looked suspiciously like instant noodles. He had the same stubborn set to his jaw, the same messy hair, and eyes that held the spark of a man who had never learned how to back down from a fight. Jiho couldn't breathe. His heart, the one that had been a cold stone for a century, began to thrum with a terrifying, rhythmic heat. "I think you dropped this," the young man said. He reached down and picked up a small, glowing digital transit card that must have fallen from Jiho's pocket. Jiho didn't reach for the card. He reached for the man's face, his hand hovering an inch from the skin. It wasn't cold anymore. He could feel the warmth radiating from the stranger, a feverish heat that tasted of cedarwood and 100 years of waiting. The young man froze. He looked at Jiho, really looked at him. His brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, followed by a sudden, sharp clarity. His groceries hit the pavement with a messy thud. "You," the young man breathed. He didn't say Jiho. He didn't say Reaper. He said it like a prayer he'd forgotten he knew. "Gunwoo," Jiho rasped, his voice breaking under the weight of a century's worth of unshed tears. Gunwoo didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his movement a chaotic blur of limbs and pure, unadulterated joy. He tackled Jiho, slamming him back against the bench in a soul-crushing hug. He buried his face in Jiho's neck, breathing in the scent of winter and incense that had finally returned to him. "You're late," Gunwoo choked out, his hands gripping Jiho's coat as if he expected the Reaper to turn into dust again. "You're 100 years late for our next appointment, you big, dramatic idiot." Jiho wrapped his arms around him, pulling him so close their heartbeats merged into a single, frantic rhythm. He wasn't flickering. He wasn't fading. For the first time since 1926, Song Jiho was entirely, undeniably present. He pulled back just enough to look at Gunwoo, the same face, the same smile, a soul that had traveled through the great beyond just to find its way back to the shadow that loved it. "I had some paperwork to finish," Jiho whispered. Then, he leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of desperation or a kiss of goodbye. It was a kiss of arrival. It tasted of the future, of quiet mornings in apartments that didn't frost over, and of a life that was finally, blissfully, mortal. The Reaper had finally closed the file, and for the first time in forever, the clock was just beginning to tick.